This is Greg Corombos of Radio America reporting for WorldNet Daily. My guest at this time is Matthew Vadum. He's a senior editor at the Capital Research Center in Washington, and he's also the author of the brand new book, Subversion Inc., How Obama's ACORN Red Shirts Are Still Terrorizing and Ripping Off American Taxpayers. The book is published by WND Books. And Matthew, thanks so much for being with us.
Hey, thank you, Greg.
Well, some people might think of the topic of ACORN as old news, given that the president is not officially connected with them anymore. The scandal involving the hidden videos is a few years ago, but the subtitle of your book makes it very clear that this threat, as you put it, to America and our democracy is not over when you say you're still terrorizing and ripping off American taxpayers. Explain for our listeners, almost in reverse order here, how ACORN has kind of morphed after officially dissolving itself into many other organizations that you believe are still up to the same old tricks.
That's right. When they filed for bankruptcy on election day in November, but meanwhile, their various state chapters were busy, even before that, incorporating themselves separately under new names. And one of them, for example, is called Pennsylvania Communities Organizing for Change. It has the same people involved in it. It's the same office on Broad Street in Philadelphia. It's the same office space, the same resources, the same pretty well everything. And what they did is they have been active in politics ever since then. This group, which uses the business name, it gets very complicated, anything having to do with ACORN. You have to dig below the surface. But the Pennsylvania group adopted a business name, Action United, and they disrupted a board meeting of Aetna Insurance last week in order to make a political point. So and also during the election season last year, they were campaigning on behalf of Joe Sestak, the unsuccessful Democrat for the U.S. Senate seat, who was bested by Pat Toomey, now the senator, Republican senator from Pennsylvania. So these groups are all over the place in Pennsylvania, Maryland, D.C., California, Arkansas, the Pacific Northwest, Missouri, Texas. They're Massachusetts, and they are doing the same sorts of things that ACORN did before, engaging in massive voter fraud, intimidating banks and other corporations, and stirring up trouble in order to basically to wreck the American system, which has always been their goal ever since they grew out of the radical New Left in the late 1960s. They are, philosophically speaking, although their tactics are not the same, ideologically they are soulmates to the Weather Underground, the terrorist group that Bill Ayers was involved in, and that everyone knows a lot about by now.
Matthew, let's talk a little bit about the issue of voter fraud, since that's probably the most recent activity that folks are aware of and potentially might impact their view of the organization and this story the most. Talk to our listeners a little bit about just the number of convictions that came down in the past couple of election cycles, and whether or not ACORN, you mentioned they're going about the same business, potentially fraudulently registering voters and so forth. Are they using the same tactics as they have before? You mentioned in the book how they registered Mickey Mouse, Mary Poppins, and others dozens and dozens of times. Is it going to look the same this time?
Yes, absolutely. It's going to look the same time. It's going to look the same this time because ACORN has a certain way of doing things, and they hire the worst people they can find, sometimes literally right out of prison, and they even will accept people convicted of identity theft to do the sensitive, important work of filling the voter rolls. This is particularly worrisome in any democratic society. So yes, they're up to their old tricks, and they're doing the same thing, and the organization, which at the national level has disbanded, is going to regroup. It's going to refederate under a new umbrella group with a brand new name in time for the 2012 election. And this is not some conjecture on my part. ACORN insiders have confirmed that this is going to happen.
We're talking with Matthew Vadum. The book is Subversion Inc. And Matthew, the picture on the cover, as well as the name in the subhead, refers to President Obama. I think folks who have studied this story closely know that he had ties with them back in the 90s and perhaps tangentially even before that. As we go forward into 2012, what connections remain, and why should folks pay attention to Obama's either previous or perhaps still recurring role with this group? Because
the ACORN people, there are ACORN people in the administration. For example, the most notable one is Patrick Gaspard. He was President Obama's political director in the White House up until recently. Political director is the same title Karl Rove held in President Bush's White House. Now, Patrick Gaspard is in charge of the Democratic National Committee as its executive director, and he's in charge of their direct action pressure group known as Organizing for America, which is part of the Democratic Party. And so the fact that an ACORN operative, well-schooled in the tactics of the late Saul Alinsky, the small-C communist who inspired a generation or two of community organizers, is something that people ought to worry about. And it's not just, the book isn't just about ACORN. The book is about Saul Alinsky and the brutal, in-your-face tactics of intimidation that sometimes included violence. People who adhere to Saul Alinsky's destructive way of doing things dominate the Obama administration. There's a woman named Heather Booth who runs a training center for community organizers called the Midwest Academy. She's a trainer for the Democratic National Committee. And there are plenty of other people who are involved from labor unions and in the upper echelons of the Democratic Party. Another one is Los Angeles Mayor Antonio Villaraigosa. He is also an Alinskyite, and these people are very dangerous because people on the right, conservatives, and libertarian-minded people who favor the free market, they don't know what they're getting into when they're getting into a conflict with Saul Alinsky-inspired community organizers, because with them, the ends justify the means. They're just like Niccolo Machiavelli, the author of The Prince.
Sure.
They believe that getting it done, getting whatever they want to get done is so important, they will use any means that they can at their disposal. And that sometimes includes violence. In fact, Saul Alinsky was a big proponent of violence. He thought that if conking somebody on the head on a strike line, on a picket line, if it could be politically useful, he was all in favor of it.
Matthew Vadum is a senior editor at the Capital Research Center in Washington. His book is Subversion Inc., How Obama's ACORN Red Shirts Are Still Terrorizing and Ripping Off American Taxpayers. It's published by WND Books. In the second half of our conversation, we'll find out what Mr. Vadum thinks is the key to stopping the advances, especially the illegal advances of ACORN, and we'll also get his insights on ACORN's role in the subprime mortgage housing crisis. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America, reporting for WorldNet Daily. This is Greg Corombos of Radio America reporting for WorldNet Daily. My guest at this time is Matthew Vadum of the Capital Research Center. His book is Subversion Inc., How Obama's ACORN Red Shirts Are Still Terrorizing and Ripping Off American Taxpayers. It's published by WND Books. If you missed the first part of our conversation, you can find it on this website. We talked mainly about the threat that ACORN still poses to American democracy and why it's still relevant as Barack Obama heads towards a re-election bid in the year 2012. But now we continue my conversation with my question to Mr. Vadum as to what the so-called kryptonite might be for ACORN. How does an organization this powerful and prone to violent tactics get stopped?
Well, you just have to monitor these people. You have to expose them, and you have to get journalists to report about them. And that's never been an easy task, and it's especially not going to be easy right now because most of the American people think that ACORN is dead, and they don't understand that it is merely taking a pause, and it is restructuring itself. It's having, like after a failed football season, this is a rebuilding year for ACORN. They are putting the organization back together. And parts of it were not even dissolved because they're legally separate, such as ACORN Housing continues to operate, continues to try to get people to take out mortgage loans that they can't afford. It has simply changed its name to Affordable Housing Centers of America. The Voter Fraud Division, as I like to call it, the Vote Factory, Project Vote, which Obama worked for in 1992, and is a branch of ACORN. It operates right now unmolested from the same office on 8th Street Southeast in Washington, D.C., across from the Marine Barracks that ACORN used as its Washington, D.C. base for decades. So these groups are still out there. It's just that they've distanced themselves from the ACORN brand because it was destroyed thanks to the fine work of the conservative activists Hannah Giles and James O'Keefe, who caught ACORN employees encouraging them to create a brothel for pedophiles and to lie to the tax authorities and to defraud banks in order to make it happen. This is just, a lot of people don't understand that this is not an anomaly for ACORN. This is what ACORN does every day. This is why in the videos that you saw, the undercover videos, the ACORN employees, they didn't seem shocked. Did you notice that, Greg? They did not seem concerned. Nobody said, "Oh, well, this is prostitution. That's terrible. I'm going to call the police or get out of here." They didn't do that. And in only maybe one of the offices where they did their sting did the ACORN employee, politely tell them to drop dead out in California. The rest of the ACORN employees were only too willing to bend over backwards to help these people do things that are illegal, because ACORN is a radical group inspired by the New Left in the 1960s, and they want to destroy the system, and they wage war against it every single day. They're not just some nice group that tries to help poor people. They are, as I've argued in the book, essentially an urban terrorist organization. They they pick out their targets and they terrorize them and intimidate them, be they state and local governments or banks or corporations that they're hoping to shake down for donations. They're a dangerous group.
Just a couple of minutes left here with Matthew Vadum. The book is Subversion Inc. And Matthew, let's talk finances real quickly in our last couple of minutes here on a couple of different fronts. You alluded to it a moment ago, and that's ACORN's role in the mortgage crisis. Just how deep were they in peddling loans to folks who probably shouldn't have been trying to get them in the first place, and what kind of pressure were they putting on banks?
Well, what they were doing is they used the Community Reinvestment Act, which came out in the Jimmy Carter years and then was strengthened, was given added enforcement, added teeth in the Clinton years. And so they agitated and they pressured banks to make loans to people who shouldn't have received loans, their constituents in the inner cities of America. And what they would do is they'd go to the banks and say, if you don't do this, we're going to block your merger request. We're going to testify against you. There's a regulatory process, and we're going to put in objections and prevent your merger from taking place. So they were very powerful in getting the banks to listen to them. They knew how to focus in on the area where the banks are weakest, because banks traditionally don't fight back very strongly in terms of public relations. They're very timid, very, very conservative in terms of their business approach. If you come along and you surround a bank or you storm it and occupy it with your activists and take it over and have a sit-in, banks get very frightened, and they're usually willing to come to the bargaining table pretty quickly. And they've been doing this for decades, and the Community Reinvestment Act allowed them to do this. In fact, it invited them to do it. And ACORN excelled at doing this kind of thing. And if not checked, it's going to keep doing it in the future. This was one of the factors that contributed to, it's not the sole factor, there's interest rates and other policies that had an impact, but certainly pushing loans onto people who can't afford them is a destructive antisocial thing. In fact, ACORN went even so far, Greg, as to strong-arm banks into accepting welfare as income on mortgage applications. Think about that for a second. If you're on welfare, should you be buying a home? I think most reasonable people would say no, you should be renting until such time as you can afford a home. But that wasn't good enough for ACORN. ACORN wants to destroy the system, so they were quite happy to overload the financial system with all sorts of bad loans by forcing banks to accept welfare benefits such as food stamps as income on loan applications. And this is so incredibly nihilistic and destructive. I'm amazed more people weren't outraged about it while it was happening, but it didn't get a lot of press coverage. ACORN and the profession of community organizing were virtually ignored by the mainstream media until a community organizer, in the person of Barack Obama, became a serious contender for the White House. Then suddenly, everybody wanted to know what a community organizer was. So now that the public has been educated about the dangers and the evils of Saul Alinsky-inspired community organizing, people have to be on guard, and they have to get upset about this kind of thing and push reporters to cover it and talk about it at Tea Party rallies and engage in activism in order to serve as a check on this evil antisocial behavior.
Matthew, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you, sir, very much for your time today. We appreciate it.
Okay, thank you, Greg.
Matthew Vadum is a senior editor at the Capital Research Center in Washington. His new book is Subversion Inc., How Obama's ACORN Red Shirts Are Still Terrorizing and Ripping Off American Taxpayers. It's published by WND Books. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America, reporting for WorldNet Daily.